Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So that's a traditional starting homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, which monastics in my tradition usually recite before we speak at all. And I thought today that a good subject to speak about would be to talk about a sutta which I really love called the Ahara Sutta, which means food or nourishment. And it's in the Connected Discourses 4651. And it's specifically about how to nourish the factors of awakening in the mind. So the bright states that the Buddha spoke of as a foundation in terms of our practice and life, and how to starve the hindrances, which are the blockages of insight and calm in the mind. And it's, I think, too robust of a sutta to go into in one talk. So I thought to just focus on the hindrances and how the Buddha spoke of starving them. And this sutta is significant because it provides very practical instructions in how we can shape ourselves through the use of attention into tools that can better serve the world and those around us, into vessels of love, and also how we use attention to move towards awakening and to purify our own hearts. And essentially that by availing ourselves of this tool of attention and the ability to nourish the bright qualities in the mind and starve the dark ones, that we have access to a radical freedom that is independent of conditions, and which turns every moment in our lives and every situation, no matter how mundane it might seem, into an opportunity and a path towards the complete purity of heart, which is the goal of the Buddha's teaching and of every spiritual path. And the Buddha speaks about the origin of the bright qualities and dark qualities of the mind, the nutriment for them, as yoniso manasikara, which is translated as appropriate attention. And it's a term in Pali that's derived from yoniso, which is etymologically from or related to the word yoni for womb, and denoting the essential aspect of experience, or something going straight to the heart. And manasikara, which manas means mind or intellect, and kara is action. So it's the action of the mind. So this is frequently translated as wise attention or appropriate attention. And the Buddha speaks about how when one brings unwise attention to one's experience in the world, then these dark qualities increase. And when one brings wise attention to one's experience in the world, then the bright qualities in the mind increase. And this reminds me of a quote which I reference often from Hegel, where he says that evil lies in the gaze that sees evil all around it. And I remember coming back, I returned to the US last November fortuitously on election night, and found the world that people lived in was very different than the one that they lived in when I'd left about 2 years earlier, and very, very different from the world that I'd left initially when I ordained about 8 years earlier. Even though almost everything in their life was the same, the news was not the same. And how often people were checking their iPhones was not the same. And the news feed and the headlines were not the same. And the world that I found people living in was darker and ridden with fear and a worldview which said that things were broken in a way they'd never been before. And there's some truth to that. The last year was a mess in many ways. Politics, pandemic, etc. No matter what side of the political spectrum you fall on, I think we can all agree that it was a trying time, and that reality in its darker form reared its head. And yet, so much of what was darkening people's world was not their immediate experience, which largely hadn't changed. Still, people lived in these networks of love and care. Still, they had enough. Many of the people I knew, because we were blessed with that. And I acknowledge that many people didn't have that. But that's not who I am speaking to about in terms of who I was encountering right when I returned home. And not only were their worlds darker, but something in them had darkened too. And this is the secret, is that, or the implication of yoniso manasikara, is that what we apply our attention to grows and becomes energized from that attention. So in this sutta, the Buddha speaks initially about the hindrances, and the hindrances are sensual desire, kamachanda in Pali, ill will, vyapada, sloth and torpor, tinamita, restlessness and remorse, which is a great word in Pali. It's uttacha kukucha, which is very onomatopoeic. And then restless doubt, vichagicha, which is also kind of onomatopoeic as well. And these are the mind states or things in the mind that the Buddha said prevented the heart from achieving calm and insight. And it's in meditation, it's very useful to see what's coming up and which one we lean most towards, what's blocking us from becoming still and bright and calm. If it's thinking about the cake you're about to eat or did eat, that's kamachanda. If it's disliking the person next to you for breathing loudly, that's probably ill will, and so on. So the Buddha said that what feeds the unarisen hindrance of sensual desire, kamachanda, and what brings it into being and strengthens that desire once already arisen is attention to the sign of the beautiful. And what starves it is appropriate attention given to the sign of the unbeautiful. And the Pali words are subha and asubha. Subha is beautiful, and asubha, is the negative prefix, so asubha is the non-beautiful. And this can be a bit of a buzzkill for modern Western audiences, and plays into a common view that Buddhism teaches some sort of self-mortification or negative view of the world. But so much of it is just a bringing ourselves down to the reality of a situation and a sobering up. And when the mind is becoming drunk on that same fantasy of the uh, delight you want to have in some experience, or caught up in, say, the crush one has on another person, or looking forward to that drink at the end of the day, then the mind becomes colored with that and obsesses about it again and again. And we recognize after we've run through that movie a good 10 times that it's not especially satisfying. And yet we don't know what else to go to. And the mind is hungry enough that it continues to feed off of that. And in doing so, it unconsciously cuts itself off from a resting in a bright stillness that's slightly disconnected from those sensual desires. And this is why paying attention to the sign of the unbeautiful doesn't imply some morbid focus on the ugly aspects of life that leads one to a darkness. The men and women I've encountered who've cultivated this path live simple lives, and yet because they've stopped letting their minds go out constantly and attach to this and that, the heart slowly brightens. It's as if it's a flame, and if there's constantly this wind of sensual desire blowing it here and there, it's always sputtering and flailing. And yet, when we just rest for a time and let it be in a quiet stillness of meditation, of mindfulness, then slowly it grows brighter and brighter until it alone is enough. And a happiness coming from that internal sense of well-being, from unification of mind, from purpose, from loving kindness, from a sense of self-worth that comes from a deep devotion to moral conduct. That is a happiness which is not fragile and which is not dependent on external conditions of getting that cake or of your loved one acting as you would like them to act. All that it depends on is you putting aside enough time in your day that you can bring the mind and heart back to its center and let that flame grow once again. And the happiness that grows from that is a bright awareness. I've used this metaphor before. It's like the taste of fresh snow. It's sweet, but only available if for a time we've stepped back from our gluttony towards the rest of the world. So this is just, frequently a subha is applied in meditation by looking at the body and observing how it's composed of just calcium, flesh, and blood, and how this allows just a slight stepping back from the body image, which causes us to torture ourselves over our own fitness or beauty and to attach to others based on that as well. But it extends further by observing that the cake that you've been thinking about all day is, once it enters the mouth, becomes a mash of dough and saliva and enters into the stomach acid. These are not terribly romantic reflections, but that's the point, is that it lets you come back to a place of balance in line with the world and lets the heart stop getting drunk on these same old things. And only then can it begin to cultivate a nourishment which is much more sustaining. So yeah, one way to good way to cultivate this is to think about the process of food going through the body's digestion system, or if in the case of being attached to a loved one's body or anyone's body, just thinking about what a body really is: hair, skin, etc. And sensual desire is strong enough that you don't have to worry about this completely destroying the sexual impulse or anything, if you're in a relationship. But I think we all recognize how damaging it is when people go through the world looking at others in terms of their bodily image and the suffering involved in that, and the huge damage that unrestrained sensual desire does to people in relationship. So this is just allowing a slight cooling. The next, and this is the one I would like to spend more time on, is the hindrance of ill will, vyapada. And ill will is interesting because it's one of the easiest ones to abide in at a low level buzz for our whole lives. And I think we all know those stories which we go back to time and again. The argument that you had 2 years ago that you should have said something different in, or that guy who's just at work doing that thing again. And how giving attention to what the Buddha speaks of as the sign of resistance or annoyance is what strengthens that, where he's giving attention to the sign of love and loving kindness and the four incarnations of loving kindness, namely metta, loving kindness, mudita, compassion, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, and upekkha, equanimity or equipoise. How this weakens that hindrance. And in my experience, this is where yoniso manasikara, or appropriate attention, needs to be used very skillfully. And the Buddha gives a large number of skillful means to work with and against this hindrance, and to feed the good side of the mind and to starve this hindrance of ill will. And yes, at its most simple, there's loving kindness. And you can apply this in very powerful ways. My teacher always recommended Westerners start meditation with 10 minutes of loving kindness. We've been conditioned by our Christian upbringings and by consumerist culture to be brutal with ourselves and to self-flagellate constantly. And it's one of the great tragedies of the West that people, and sometimes the best people, are so unbelievably critical of themselves. There's a famous story of a translator trying to explain to the Dalai Lama what self-hatred meant, and the Dalai Lama not being able to understand until this translator had spoken on it for 10 minutes. And then the Dalai Lama looking up with tears in his eyes and said, why do people do this to themselves? And from living in Thailand, a culture that's far more integrated and less isolating, and meeting the people in that society who don't have the same propensity to destroy themselves, at least not yet. Although I think consumers culture is making inroads in Thailand that will soon change this recollection completely again. But just the gentleness that people handle themselves with, and the sense underneath it of having a sense of self-worth that's not constantly being destroyed. It was refreshing, and it gives you perspective on how unbalanced we are in the West around this. So one fights this or works with it by using many skillful means. And one is that when one wakes up, usually the mind will try to crystallize it around one subject or object. And so frequently that's an aversive mind state or object. You know, the person at work who's just not falling into line like they should, or something like that. And if right upon waking, one remains lying down and brings awareness to the heart and cultivates a glow there of loving kindness towards oneself and towards all beings, then suddenly the mind is crystallizing around something very positive for the whole day. And that slight bit of intention right there at that moment of waking pays huge dividends through the day, because you're coloring the rest of your experience in that moment through a very clear act and intention of saying, I will not let my mind begin today by hating or by disliking. I will begin my day by moving myself in line and in tune with something much brighter. And similarly, throughout our days, really watching as aversion comes up towards our situation and towards the people around us, and very consciously turning our attention towards the good qualities in those people. Or if we can't do that, then trying to find out where those neuroses or problems in those people, where those originate from, what conditions caused them, what suffering in their childhood or elsewhere brought that into being, and finding compassion in that. And I think we all have that experience of finding out something about someone's childhood or past that explains why they are the way they are, and suddenly everything makes sense. And there's a sense of being okay with that. And if we also look at people not as obstacles to us, but rather any difficulty we're having with them as a tool and means towards our practice of patience, of learning to care better, and towards being more careful with our speech, the most difficult people become our greatest teachers. And that's a role of appropriate attention in turning an object of ill will into an object of gratitude. And I had this experience very concretely with a monk who was constantly admonishing me for pretty much everything from not cleaning up well enough in our room that we shared to closing the door too loudly. And I very consciously took it on for that whole year to make that monk my teacher, and to learn to, because the things he was pointing out were true. I could close the door more quietly, and I did sometimes not clean up quite well enough. And by not only taking this monk as a teacher in terms of refining my conduct, which I would have done if he was a great, one of the great Ajahns, one of the great teachers, and conceptualizing him like that, or like a bodhisattva sent to teach me, but also as a means through which I could develop loving kindness, then I became profoundly grateful for that monk and that friend in my life. And in the end, we became good friends. And sometimes you have to bolster such a relationship through very concrete action and direct one's attention. So the people you're having difficulty with, make it a point of giving them gifts. Make it a point of sitting with them and talking with them longer than you would otherwise. And this is your practice. Sometimes it's not enough just to hold that recollection, but actually making a very strong point of embodying it in action, and taking that extra moment to sit with them and share something and learn about them until you can find that place of compassion and gratitude, even for that. That's wise attention directed through wise action. And sometimes it's not enough just to spread this sort of brightness. Sometimes one has to use wise attention to look at the darker sides of the world and cultivate dispassion towards them. Because only through seeing the problematic and difficult aspects of the external world do we learn to slowly detach from that, in the sense of not looking to it for refuge. So when the political situation in a country goes to hell, then I remember when I came back to the US, one of my teachers said, look, you can go back and look at the news sometimes, but your job as a practitioner, as a monk, is to never let it give rise to even one unwholesome mind state. And how do you do that? So one technique is to direct wise attention towards the sign of love towards these people. But sometimes you just can't feel love towards every politician. So how do you use wise attention in that case? And I'd say that there's a good place for seeing that this is the way the world is. And we've lived in a bubble for a long time. And you look at the Buddha's time and how uh, clans, the Buddha's own clan was slaughtered. How some of his greatest disciples, King Bimbisara, was killed by his son. And how the Buddha walked through all that with equanimity. And even those most heinous of criminals, King Ajatasattu, who killed his father, came to the Buddha later. And the Buddha received him and taught him the Dhamma. And in the end, King Ajatasattu bowed and said, I have done something horrible in that I killed my father, who was a good man. And the Buddha said that one who acknowledges a transgression and determines not to do it in the future grows in this path. And in the end, King Ajatasattu sponsored the first Buddhist council and did great good. And the fact that even circumstances such as that, which are much more the norm than the sort of fairy tale which our politics have been for the last 100 years, no matter how brutal that fairy tale has seemed, comparatively it's nothing. And to look at that this is the way of the world, and not that we don't try to change that, not that we don't apply appropriate action politically when it's appropriate, but that we stop thinking it's wrong that it's like this. This is the way it is. And there's dispassion there. And when we see that, then we stop looking to external conditions to sustain and hold us securely, because they can't. They are fragile and they will fall. So then what do you come to? You see the problems in looking to that for refuge, and you come to your practice and your heart and your ability to give to those around you and love those close to you and to meditate. And that's where your refuge is. So even there, appropriate attention can be used. And in doing so, we shape ourselves and the world. And I don't think we understand the upper limit of that. There's a amazing story of a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was stuck in, he's a Russian writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I believe. And he was put into the gulags, the Soviet work camps, for at least 10 years, I believe. And whereas countless people in those work camps became corrupted and hopeless, he speaks about men and women in those camps who didn't, and how a common theme for them was not only a reliance on a strict code of a morality and a purpose, but what he did with his time was he went through his life and looked at all the little things he'd done that had made him complacent in that system, that might have caused this to happen in some sense. And he took a radical responsibility for that. And he chose not to grow hopeless, but he rather looked towards those souls in those camps that seemed immutable and uncorruptible. And there were some bright lights in those camps that did just that. And they were not few, he says. And he gave his attention and his heart to those figures. And he wrote his expose of the gulags, which were completely secret for much of the history of the Soviet Union, and yet led to tens of millions of Soviet civilians being slaughtered. And because these were so well, the secret was so well kept, the Soviet form of communism still seemed quite attractive to many people. The French bourgeoisie was constantly and ironically flirting with the whole idea of becoming communist, until Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote this whole book, The Gulag Archipelago, which is 3 volumes in his head as he was in these camps. And later when it came out, it was printed on undercover printing presses, and when it was passed to a new person, they had 24 hours to read it before passing it on. And in many ways, it was responsible for the downfall of the Soviet Union. And in this way, he took the most brutal, hellish circumstance one could imagine, and he turned his attention towards his own responsibility and his own role, and towards the brightness around him, and he found purpose even in that. And he shaped himself and his world into something utterly different than the world and the self shaped by every or most other people in those camps. And he brought about an amazing change in the world just through that. So we can look to him, or the Tibetan Lama who held imprisoned by the Tibetan or by the Chinese authorities for 20 years, emerged with his greatest fear being that he would have lost love for his captors, and that he didn't. We can look to him, or to all these other examples of what happens when appropriate attention is applied and used to shape the world and one into something that utterly transcends circumstance. And that this is the radical freedom and therefore the radical responsibility of the spiritual path. Because we, no matter what our circumstances, can apply this attention to change ourselves and our worlds, then we always have the responsibility to do so as practitioners. And the only way that one can maintain enough of a center to do that is by sitting and meditating a little bit every day. At least a little bit. More is better. And yeah, that's, I think, how we don't let evil reside in our gaze as we see evil and only evil all around us. But rather we see good and we become good through that. Not turning a blind eye, but rather finding a way of applying attention that decreases these hindrances and never allows even one unwholesome mind state, and never allows ourselves the excuse of saying, this situation justifies my self-righteous anger. This situation justifies this bad action. As practitioners, we don't have that freedom. Our freedom, and therefore our responsibility, is to take every situation and determine to not let it give rise to even one unwholesome mind state. And that's the power of Yoniso Manasikara. And we still have another 3 hindrances and 7 enlightenment factors to go. But we might just hold that for now, because I think ill will and that darkness which pervades in that way is enough to sit with for a good few lifetimes. So we have a chance for some discussion if people are interested or have any questions that they'd like to bring up.
When do you read things like Hegel and so forth in the past, in college, now, integrated with your...
I like books on tape a lot. I reserve most of my actual studying for the suttas. And I think it's different for monastics because we're kind of immersed in, say, the Pali Suttas a lot, and this is what we think about and talk about, or should be thinking about and talking about, although sometimes not. So then I find when you bring in these, say, listen to, I try to rely on nonfiction more, and then these connections just sort of come out, I find, and those are really potent connections for me. I think for lay people who are already being bombarded by so many things in the world, be it conversation, etc., then it's almost like it's more useful maybe to devote that spare time of study towards the spiritual texts, whatever one's tradition is. But for me, yeah, I do find that Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, sometimes the Dhamma, I think, is everywhere. And sometimes it's in the strangest places that you find it. And I think it's part of wise attention is finding that seed of Dhamma in everything. And I remember like one of the most affecting books I read recently or last year was a biography. I share my mom's Audible account, and there's a memoir called Drinking, a Love Story. And it was written in like 1999, and it's just about this woman's sort of slow fall into alcoholism by the time she was 30, and just how pervasive that is. and so hidden from most people. And it was deeply affecting because I just saw this truth of addiction and of that slow fall into this thing, and how I myself in my own ways fall into addiction. But to see it, I mean, that was one of the most Dhammic things I've read in a long time, but it was not where I expected it at all. So yeah, so I don't know. It just sort of stumble on them, and then some stuff hits better than others, I guess. But I don't find it as much in fiction usually. Usually it's nonfiction or podcasts that are appropriate, you know.
Are you able to stay in touch with your monastic community while you're here?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, I have regular contact with a lot of really wonderful monastics.
Are they back in Thailand or all around the world?
Yeah, there's a community I ordained with in Wat Mapjan outside of Bangkok, and several senior teachers who I know there. And I try to, but then there's also communities here in the US, and there's some monastics of my own age, or monastic age, so, you know, who I speak to. But I try to maintain regular contact with the elders in the tradition. Because one of the things that really has helped me remain in robes and motivated me to ordain in the first place was meeting monastics who I feel had done what I did not know was possible, in that their hearts were unlike anyone's I'd ever met. I remember in lay life being so hungry to meet someone like that, to the point where, you know, if I met, say, a really lovely bus driver who just seemed like spiritually glowing a little bit, I would just think about it for days. And then to meet beings who I felt were enlightened, that should shake you, because then you realize what you have the potential to be. And I remember this first happened when I just saw a video of Ajahn Chah online. There's a 5-minute video of him being interviewed in front of Chithurst Monastery in England during his visit to the West. And if you haven't looked up that interview, then you should. Or similarly, almost an interview with Pema Chodron. Her eyes kind of like, sort of like she sort of stares at you, and you just feel like you should be meditating a lot more, you know? But yeah, meeting people like that and realizing what there's a term in Pali called Kalyanamitta, which means beautiful friend. And people think that as a monastic, you step back from love and it's sort of this life-denying thing. But you meet people like this and a different sort of love comes, where I'm in love with these people and I've that spiritual love, and it's just, there's nothing lost, you know. And so I try to maintain connections with them, and also that just that same love manifests in terms of community like this. The more you circle around these circles of really dedicated practitioners who aren't just dabbling or vaguely interested, but who actually acknowledge that the potential of the human heart and what duty that lays on our shoulders to cultivate that. It means so much to meet people with that same hunger and to speak with them. And I find that there's a huge love there. And so that's very sustaining, even if I don't always get to speak to my own monastic brothers. And the monastic family, you have like your brothers, you have your grandfathers, and then you have your like eccentric uncles. There's a lot of eccentric uncles in the Sangha, and aunts as well. And I try to maintain regular contact with my bhikkhuni sisters as well. So, good question. That's actually something I think people should avail themselves more of. Is there's monastics in the West right now who I think are enlightened. And it is rare in a lifetime to get to meet someone like that. And if it means you have to drive, 5 hours on a 3-day weekend to do it, then you should do it. And if it means you have to pay a few $100s for a flight, it's worth doing sometime in a life, and many times.
I think I also hear, and what I'm kind of inspired from the words to think about is finding the teacher around me, or, just finding the people around me, and the people, I'm just like, oh, that's beautiful. That moment of courage, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That's another. They're closer by.
Yeah, they are closer by, and that is quite nice, and it requires less of a ticket.
Yes.
And it also speaks to this difference between, you know, using where you are and at the same time looking to tap into these other conditions which are helpful and nearby. It reminds me of a discussion Ajahn Chah had when he came to the West. There was a monk who disrobed who was translating for him. And Ajahn Chah would tease this monk, like this former monk, mercilessly. And he was talking about how the Buddha lived in the forest and practiced in the forest. And he said, look, Joseph, or no, who was this? Look, like, where was the Buddha when he became enlightened? And this former monk was like very witty, and he was like, in his heart. And where did the Buddha become enlightened? And Ajahn Chah, and he was like, he became enlightened in his heart. And Ajahn Chah was like, yes, but where was he sitting? Under a tree. And so it speaks to the same thing of like, yes, we use the situation we're in, and the whole practice can be in the heart. And there's an enlightened being, you know, 10 hours away. For God's sake, go see that person, you know. So. Okay.
Can you speak a little bit about your dream and what you're building with Cascade Hermitage and what's being manifested right now?
Thanks, Mara. Yeah. So the question was, for those on the live stream, what is the vision of Cascade Hermitage at the moment, and what are my parents and to an extent myself working on? And yeah, my parents really began practicing in earnest about 5-10 years ago. I mean, they've been practicing much longer, but you know, I think it really took off even more so recently, to the point where I know my dad retired about 5 years early in order to pursue practice more. And one of the most concrete ways they hoped to do that was to move from Spokane and settle here near Winthrop and start something called the Cascade Hermitage, where they're hoping to build 2 monastic huts where they'll be able to invite nuns and monks from around the world to come on retreat long-term, 1 month, 2 month, shorter, longer, and to offer free teachings to the community. So that's the dream, and that those teachings and those retreat would be a good gift to everyone. And I'll hopefully be supporting that by coming the last weekend of every month and helping lead a free retreat. But also every Sunday at this time, 9:30 to 11:30, they'll hopefully be having a gathering of a community here, and hopefully build a community, a spiritual family, little by little. And hopefully also bring monastics in. They'll be giving teachings here, live streaming monastics as well, and really centering around that monastic core. And that's part of the dream, I think. Anything to add, Mom, Dad? It's a lovely dream. So yeah, we're hoping it's just a refuge for people insofar as they want it. That's that. And then I'll be going to Seattle and beginning something called Clear Mountain Monastery. And yeah, and that's sort of the hope at this point.
Is Clear Mountain in existence right now?
No, it is a website and the idea of me in a hut. So that's what we got. But all things begin somewhere. Yeah. But to be fair, Cascade Hermitage is actually, it's a bit more. There's property actually with you guys. And we have a trailer and 2 tents and a tin shed, which I built, and Mara. It blew down the first time, but now it's back up. So. That's not a metaphor. But all these things really do. Yeah, I mean, there's a real importance to spiritual community like this. And I find that if it's given with open hands, and these teachings are given as completely free and really felt that way, then everything comes from that. And so hopefully there can be a group that holds each other in this, you know.
So are you hoping there'll be a Sangha in Seattle with regular meditation and yoga talks?
Yeah, hopefully. Hopefully.
Somewhere in the future.
Yes, I mean, I'll be arriving in July, and then, you know, we'll see. But here, this is hopefully beginning now or 4 weeks ago, and we'll see what comes from there.
In Seattle will be somewhat like what this is here, where you find a community center and you're teaching out of.
Maybe we sort of have a park. We're trying to find the right park. We had a place to stay inside, but then now we don't, and so we're not quite sure. But things usually come out, happen. So it's sort of, we're forest monks, so it's appropriate that we sort of start in a place where we get rained on a bit, So somehow that's feels natural.
Oh, there's a little forest school in the Arboretum, I just could imagine, and they have a little tarp, and they don't do it
In
on
Seattle?
Sundays. In Seattle, in the Seattle Arboretum.
Let's talk.
Yeah, I don't know anything, I don't really, I used to walk and run by there, actually now I walk, but they have this great little tarp.
Okay.
And that's all it is, it just sounds like.
That's all we need.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't use it on the weekends, so it could be a possibility.
Good. So I don't want to, these are really nice questions, but I also want to let people eat and not sit too long. I'm going to turn the live stream off. Everyone who joined in the live stream, Geetha Ngana, Julie, Clark, Celia, everyone, it's been lovely to see you all, and take care. And we'll have a Q&A as usual tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. on Clear Mountain Monastery's YouTube and Facebook.